We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Zayin Amud Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 57a. And the previous Amud, the Gemara said that if one places Sa'or on a carbon mincha and causes it to leaven, it causes it to become chametz, even if it just places the Sa'or and leaves it there and it happens on its own, he is still going to be liable. And that's just like what happens on Shabbos. On Shabbos also, if somebody places the food on top of gecholim, on top of the coals, and then it roasts on its own, so he's chayiv. So the same thing is true over here. But the Gemara says on Shabbos, is that really true? But Rabbi Bar Chana said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan said, Hiniach basar al gabe gecholim. If somebody places meat on top of coals, so then hifichbo, if he turns over the meat, then chayiv, then he's liable. Then he's roasting it on both sides, he's cooking it on both sides. But lo hifichbo, but if he doesn't turn it over, so pater, then he's exempt. And so therefore you see, on the contrary, it doesn't just happen that he's chayiv if it's passive. He has to do something in order to be chayiv. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rava, Rava says, My chayiv nami deka Amar. When we're saying chayiv in the case of carbon mincha, what do we mean to say? We mean to say, kemaiset tzli shel Shabbos, like when one roasts on Shabbos, which the Gemara now will go on to explain why it is on Shabbos that it has to be turned over. But just like in a situation on Shabbos where we say one can be chayiv, essentially where it happens passively, the same thing is true by carbon mincha if it becomes chametz. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to what we just said above. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Hiniach basar al gabe gecholim. Again, one places meat on top of coals, so hipech bo chayiv, if he turns it over, he's liable. Lo hipech bo pater, if he does not turn it over, then he's pater, then he's exempt. And so the Gemara asks, Hey Chidami, what exactly is the case? Ileima de ilo hipech bei lo bashal. If the case over here is that if he doesn't turn it over, it will not cook at all, so then pshita, then it is too obvious. Then of course there's no liability, so that cannot be what Rabbi Yochanan means. Ella rather, de'ilo mahapechle nami have a bashal. It must be that even if he doesn't turn it over, it is going to cook. But then the question is, amai lo mechayev? Why isn't he liable? Why is it that only by hipechbo is he going to be liable? And the Gemara continues and answers, lo no tzricha. It's necessary. The case is as follows: De'ilo hipech be, if he doesn't turn it over, have a bashal mitzad echor kemaichel ben drusai. So then it's going to be cooked on one side. Kemaichel ben drusai means it's just going to be 1/3 cooked. It's not going to be fully cooked, and that's just going to be on one side. And if he turns it over, so bashal mishneitztad, and then it's going to be cooked on both sides. Kemaichel ben drusai, again 1/3 cooked. V'kamash malon, and so what it's teaching us is as follows: Dechol mitzad echad kemaichel ben drusai lo klamu. If on one side it's only cooked Michael ben Drusai, that's nothing. When it comes to cooking on Shabbos, if it's going to be Michael ben Drusai, it at least has to be Michael ben Drusai on both sides. And Rashi explains, Ikul ifluge ben hafach lelo hafach. Again, in a situation on Shabbos, then we can make a distinction between turning it over and not turning it over. Kagon b'chiyai gavna kin mefarsh l'kamon, as will be explained as the Gemara goes on, as we just said, in terms of the logic of Michael ben Drusai. Dilo hafach bei, dilo hafach have a bashal mitzad echad, because if he doesn't turn it over, it's only going to be cooked on one side. And so that's why we have this whole distinction between hipechbo and lo hipechbo when it comes to cooking on Shabbos. Aval gabe chimos, but when it comes to leavening, there is no such distinction, and that's why there is simply going to be liability when it happens passively. And Rashi continues, if you're going to say that if he doesn't turn it over, it won't cook, then it's too obvious. It's obvious if he doesn't turn it over, it's pater. Because it hasn't been roasted. He hasn't done anything. Michael ben Drusai, the food of ben Drusai, shlish hu mavushal, that essentially is saying that it's cooked at 1/3, it's not fully cooked. And kamash malon, it's coming to teach, hadakatani lo hipech pater, when it says if he doesn't turn it over, he's pater. Afagav de bashal mitzad echad kamichael ben Drusai, the chiddush is, even though it's cooked on one side, kamichael ben Drusai, 1/3 cooked, lav klumhi, that is nothing. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, v'im nitzla bo kegrogras, let's say it's roasted, the size of a grogras on that food is roasted, so then mitzad echad, even if it's on one side, b'makom echad, in one place, chayiv, then he is chayiv. Rashi explains, Vim nitzla bo mitzad echad kegrogras tzliya gemura. Here we're talking where it is fully roasted, and so it's fully roasted in one place, the size of a grogras. That's enough to be chayiv. Chayiv afilu kilo hipech. Then he's going to be chayiv even if he doesn't turn it over. That's what Rava says. And so the Gemara now continues and says, Amalei Ravina leRavashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, B'makom echad in b'shnayim o gimel makomos lo. It sounds like that size of a grogras where it's roasted, it can only be if it's in one place, but if it is distributed in 2 or 3 separate places on the piece of food, food, so then there would be no liability. But the problem with that is v'hatanan, but we learned in a Mishnah, hakodeach kolshu, if somebody drills kolshu, even the smallest amount, so chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. Rashi explains, kodeach chur kolshu, he drills a hole, even the smallest hole, but mekadeach b'Shabbos, he does that on Shabbos, so then he's going to be chayiv, he's going to be liable, any amount. Now the Gemara says, what's this Mishnah talking about? Hechi dami, what exactly is the case in this Mishnah in Mesechet Shabbos? Ilema b'makom echad kolshu. Now if you're going to say that in one place he drills the tiniest of holes, so lamai chazi, what does that fit for? Why would there be liability? Elalav, rather is it not? B'shnayim o shlosha mekomos, he's doing this in 2 or 3 separate places. T'chazu letziruf, and the idea is that it's fit to be combined. Sometimes when they would drill a larger hole, they would start off with 2 or 3 smaller holes and eventually enlarge it, and so therefore, again, 2 or 3 places, the amount can be scattered among those 2 or 3 places, and shouldn't that be true by roasting as well? And the Gemara says, lo no liolam b'makom echad. Actually, really, this Mishnah Mesechet Shabbos is talking about in one place where there's the tiniest of holes, but the chazu lebavadakli, it still is fit, because it's fit for the tooth of a key. You could put that in there, and therefore it's considered significant, and there's liability. The Gemara continues, Vika Diamri, there are those that say, just a different version of the Gemara above, Amar Rava, that Rava says, Afilu b'shnayim v'gimel makomos, even in 2 or 3 places, again, if the grogros is scattered where it's roasted among 2 or 3 places, there is liability. And in this version, the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravina le Ravashi, Ravina said to Ravashi, Afan onami tanina, we have support for this from a Mishnah, again, the same Mishnah, Mesechet Shabbos, Hakodeach kol shuchayv, if one drills even the smallest hole, there is liability. Hechidami, what's the case? Ilema b'makom echad, if you're going to say it's in one place, kol shu lamai chazi, so what does a kol shu fit for? Elalab b'shnayim v'shlosha makomos, rather it must be, is it not that it's 2 or 3 places, the chazi letziruf, that it's possible to combine them, and so therefore, again, you see 2 or 3 places, there is liability. But the Gemara says it's not necessarily a proof from the Mishnah. Lo no liolam b'makom echad. Really, it is just in one place. And again, d'chazu lebava de'aklida, that it's fit for the tooth of a key. And Rashi explains, the chazul etzari, if again the 2 or 3 holes can be combined, kimosha osin nagarin, that's like the carpenters do, kishetzrichin l'chor echad, when they need a hole, kodchen shlosha ketanim zebet tzad, they make 3 small holes all next to one another, umechabram osan, and then they connect them. And then lebava de'aklida, the Gemara said, for the tooth of a key, l'shein shel mafteach, the tooth of a key, sherosh ochad, that the tip is sharp, v'tochvan b'soch hateva, you put it into the box, uposech v'noel, and in that way you can open and close it. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brayso, ilu nemar asher takrivu laHashem lo seyasa chametz. If the pasuk had just said that which you offer to Hashem, you can't make it chametz, talking about karban mincha. Hayisi omer, so I would have said ainly below sase chametz ela kometz bilvad, that the lo sase in terms of making a karban mincha chametz applies only to the kometz, only to that fistful that's going to be offered to Hashem, that's going to be burned on the mizbeach. Mincha minayin, from where do we know it applies to the entire karban mincha? Let's say even before the kometz is taken. Talmud lomar mincha, the pasuk says mincha, that includes mincha. And shar menachos minayin, from where do we know other karban minchas? This pasuk was by minchas marcheshes, by the deep pan karban mincha. How do we know it applies to other minchas? Talmud lomar, the pasuk says kol hamincha asher takrivu laHashem. It says kol hamincha, it applies to shar menachos as well. And kasheira v'lo psula, it applies to a karban mincha that's kosher, but it does not apply to a karban mincha that's pasul, that's disqualified. Mikan omru, from here they say hamachmitz es aksheira chayiv. If somebody causes a kosher mincha to become chametz, then he's liable. V'yas hapsula, but if it's already a disqualified karban mincha pater, then he is pater, then he is exempt. And Rashi explains, ela kometz, I only know the kometz, this halacha of chimutz applies, that there's liability, shelo yitol kometz levado v'yachmitzenu, that he shouldn't take the kometz on its own and make it chametz. Mincha minayin, how do we know it applies to the rest of karban mincha? Shelo yachmitz kol ha-mincha yachad kodem kmitza, that he shouldn't make the entire mincha before kmitza, he shouldn't make that chametz. And then shar menachos minayin, how do we know it applies by other karban minchas? The high karban minchas marcheshes ksiv, again, as we said, this pasuk is by minchas marcheshes, the deep pan karban mincha. And psula, let's say you have a mincha that's already pasul, then it doesn't apply. And what would be an example of that? Kagon sheyotzis, let's say it leaves the proper area, o nitmes, or it becomes tameh. And the Gemara continues, Boy, Rav Papa asks the following question, Chimtza v'yotzis v'chazar v'chimtza mahu. Let's say he makes the karban mincha chametz, and then it leaves the proper area, and then again he makes it chametz. What's the halacha? Kaven the yotzis, since it left the proper area, if salallah b'yotzei, it now is disqualified through yotzei, through leaving the proper area. V'chihadar machmetz la, and therefore if he again makes it chametz, lo mechayev Allah, he's not going to be liable on that, misham machmetz achar machmetz, for making it chametz after chametz. Oh, dilma, or maybe, even the chimtza psul yotzei lo mahani bei, since if he made it chametz, so the disqualification of yotzei is no longer relevant. V'chihadar machmetz la mechayev Allah misham machmetz achar machmetz, and so then if he does make it chametz again, he will be liable for making it chametz after it's chametz. And the Gemara says teiku. The Gemara leaves that as a question. And Rashi explains v'chazar v'chimtza. He goes ahead again and makes it chametz. Kolomar gemar ma'isa chimutza sha'afa, meaning he finishes the chametz process, meaning he bakes it. Mahu, what's the halacha? Is he chayev for making it chametz after making it chametz or not? Since once it's chametz, the psul of yotzei is not effective. The lav kedusha gemuri, it doesn't have the full holiness. Ve'ein ba ela psul chimutz, it only really has the disqualification of chimutz. V'chayev keshar mechametz achar mechametz, and then we would say that he is liable just like any other case of mechametz achar mechametz. And the Gemara continues, Boy, Rav Mori asks the following question, Chimtza berosho shel mizbeach mahu. Let's say he makes it chametz at the top of the mizbeach. What's the halacha? Asher takrivu amar achmona v'ha'akrava. On the one hand, we could say Asher takrivu, it says that you will offer, but this is already offered. It's already on top of the mizbeach, and so therefore the violation would not apply. O dilma, or maybe mechusar haktar, if it's lacking being burned, it hasn't actually been burned on the mizbeach, k'mechusar ma'isa dami, so then it is missing a vital part of the process, and the Gemara says teiku. The Gemara leaves that as a question. And Rashi explains, Chimtza lekometz, he's making the kometz chametz berosho shel mizbeach, at the top of the mizbeach. Mahu, what's the halacha? Asher takrivu, it says in the pasuk Asher takrivu, mashma kol zman shemechuseres hakrava. That is understood to mean as long as it hasn't been brought close to the mizbeach, over or less, so then there's a transgression. Aval achar hakrava lo, but if it's already been brought close to the mizbeach, this is al rosho shel mizbeach, it's on the top of the mizbeach, so then we wouldn't say that. Or we say, no, mechusar haktara litna ala ish, but it's still missing being burned. It still has not been placed upon the fire. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, V'hashta denafka le mikol hamincha asher takrivu lamali. Now that we learn it out from kol hamincha, so what is asher takrivu for? And Rashi explains, V'hashta denafka lon mikol hamincha, meaning now that we learn out from the pasuk of kol hamincha dafilu keshahakometz me'orveves chayev oleh, that even if the kometz is still mixed in, meaning they haven't yet separated the kometz, there is a liability for making the karban mincha chametz. So asher takrivu, so now the pasuk says asher takrivu, that you offer. Mashma da kometz l'chudekoid. Isn't that understood to mean that we're going on the kometz? The kometz is what's offered on the mizbeach. So lamali. So now, what is that part of the pasuk for? What is asher takrivu for? That's the question of the Gemara. And the Gemara answers me, boile l'chidetanya. It's needed for what is taught in the following brisa. Again, the pasuk says asher takrivu. It says asher takrivu l'rabos minchas nesachim l'chimotz. That's to include minchas nesachim. That's the mincha and the libations that accompany an animal karban. There, for that kind of mincha as well, chimutz, the violation of making it chametz, applies. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. These are the words of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabbi Akiva says, l'rabos lechem haponim l'chimutz. It's in order to include the lechem haponim. There's a violation of chimutz, of making it chametz. And the Gemara continues and asks, Minchas Nesachim, with regards to Minchas Nesachim, which Rabbi Yossi Haglili mentioned, Mei Peiros heim. So isn't Minchas Nesachim, isn't that Mei Peiros, isn't that fruit juice? And Rashi explains, L'rabos Minchas Nesachim l'chimutz, again to include Minchas Nesachim for chimutz, meaning she'im chimtza, meaning to say that if he does make it chametz chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. And Rashi continues and explains, Misham dahai kra gabe shar menachos shashirein nechol and ksiv. The reason is because this pasuk is really written by other karban minchas, where the remainder of the karban mincha is eaten. That's where that pasuk is actually written. So itzrich l'rebuyune lahani. So that's why we have to include these cases where the remainder is not eaten. That's what we're trying to include here in this brisa. This is also what we learn in Torah's Kohanim. Ainli belosa say chametz. I only know that there's there's a violation, lo seyasa chametz, ela b'mincha sheshiren nechalin. That's only by a mincha where you have a remainder that's eaten. But menachos, but what about the kind of minchas, she'ein shirei nechalin, where there's no remainder that's eaten? Minayin, from where do we know that? Talmud lomar kol ha-mincha. The pasuk says, kol ha-mincha, lahavi minchas nesachim, and that would include minchas nesachim. And Rashi continues, Avalechem haponim, but according to that, the lechem haponim, lo laki aleh, then there would not be malchus in terms of chimutz. There would be no violation or punishment in terms of chimutz. Tekasavar, because the Tana holds midas yavish. Midas yavish means that which is measured dry, lo niskacha, it's not sanctified. Umar marbi lechem haponim, and the other opinion, that would be the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, he includes the lechem haponim and says there is a violation of chimutz by the lechem haponim. To lo teimo b'nikmotzos amar. Don't say that it's only by the type of mincha where a kometz is taken, shemehen karav lemizbech, which is from that karav mincha. There's something offered on the mizbech, the kometz. Aval hai de lo karav mine lo. But here, when it comes to lechem haponim, where there isn't something offered, then maybe we wouldn't say that. So that Tana, the one who does include lechem haponim, kasavar midas yavish niskacha, he holds that midas yavish, that dry measure, is sanctified. Aval minchas nesachim lo laki, but minchas nesachim there would not be malchus. And we will add over here 2 points. First of all, in terms of the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili l'Rabos Minchas Nesachim, the idea is that the Minchas Nesachim, the remainder is not eaten because the entire thing is burned on the Mizbeach, and the commentators point out it's not only true by Minchas Nesachim, it would be true also, for example, by the Mincha of a Kohen that is totally burned. There's no kometz over there, the entire thing is burned on the Mizbeach. That also would be included by Rabbi Yossi Haglili from Asher Takrivu, that is offered, that kind of Karban Mincha as well. There's going to be a liability in terms of chimutz, in terms of making it chametz, and in terms of the lechem haponim, Rashi is referring to the fact that most karban minchas have oil, and therefore it's midas halach. It is measured, it is liquid measured, so to speak. When it comes to lechem haponim, that is midas yavish, and that concept of midas yavish, that will be discussed on the next Amud, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis.